This video is going to cover China, Japan, and the Songhai Empire in Africa as they existed in 1500. You'll notice that your notes for this contain charts but does not contain a place to write this information on the current screen down. If you want to write these down, find some space and put it down. If not, that's up to you, but remember that everything that we talk about in class and in videos is fair game for your tests. So the big brunt of these notes are going to basically talk about how with the Chinese culture and the Japanese cultures, they were very, very different from the cultures of Europe. And as a result, were very concerned as increasing trade in 1500 that they were going to lose their own independent cultural identities. As a result, they take steps to limit the way that the Europeans contacted their cultures. Whereas in Africa, the Songhai Empire did not take that same approach, and they began working very closely with the European empires to facilitate trade, but also they began to export slaves out of Africa. The Songhai are a very, very large empire for exportation of slaves, among other things. And as a result, with contact with Europe, the traditional African systems in northern and western Africa are very much so permanently altered. China, which is located in Eastern Asia, follows Buddhist, Confucianist, and Taoist principles. We were covering that last year in World History 1, so if you don't remember anything about Buddhism, Confucianism, or Taoism, you may want to take a minute and Google those and find out that information. Europeans loved Chinese goods. We've talked about a whole list of Chinese goods: paper, porcelain, tea, the compass. There's lots of things that China has that Europeans wanted and longed for. And for hundreds of years, the only way to get Chinese goods to Europe was to trek them overland across the Silk Roads, which went from eastern China all the way to Constantinople, today's Istanbul, and from Istanbul then taken to the rest of Europe. It was very long, it was very arduous, it was very dangerous, and it was really expensive. So the Portuguese are going to find a way to get around the Silk Road by using sea routes. Most notably after Vasco da Gama takes his first trek to India, they realize you can get, obviously if you can get around Africa to India, then you can get from India to China. And you no longer have to deal with the perils of overland routes. Now we've talked about how the Chinese culture, they wanted to have an independent system. And the ruling emperor wanted to make sure that he controlled everything, because when you control it, then you make more money off of it. So what they created are enclaves. And enclaves were a lot of times on islands, but there was a series of cities that grew in these very particular areas, that merchants were the only ones allowed to live there, merchants and government officials. So it restricted Europeans from coming into China and then associating with the Chinese populations. Instead, with the enclaves, the merchants were going to live there for set times of year, and that was the only time they could trade. Now, Japan is an archipelago. It's an island chain just east of China in the Pacific Ocean. They are largely Buddhist, but they are also Shinto. They believe in the Shinto tradition. So again, if you don't remember those, you might want to look those up really quickly. They decide as a culture, the emperor and the shogun decide as a culture, that their culture is much more important than contact with any of the European cultures. So they become isolationist. They become independent and try to restrict any contact with any other cultures. So no one trades with Japan for several centuries outside of Asia. So no Europeans at all trading with Japan. They have an interesting government structure where they had an emperor who was very divine. They believed that the emperor had powers, his family had powers given to them by God, but the emperor had lost a lot of actual political force, and instead the political and the military might shifted to the shogun. And the shogun was another hereditary leader, but he was in charge of the military. And so they operated essentially the entire government while still leaving the emperor intact, and it was in order to preserve Japanese tradition. Now the Songhai are in Western Africa. If you'll remember from World History 1, you learned about the Ghana Empire and the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire all growing out of Western Africa. Now if I drew out a very sort of awkwardly drawn Africa, the Songhai are located in this part that sticks out into the Atlantic. Now, they are very, very big into trade with Europe. And in fact, they export a lot of things: salt, gold, ivory, and also slavery. They were very famous for taking over an area and then selling the citizens of that area into slavery in the Americas. And they would in exchange get manufactured goods, things like guns and the printing press and the new systems in place for creating goods. All of the things that Europe could make, and also that Europe was getting from Asia, the Songhai Empire would import, they brought into their country, including the ability to grow corn and peanuts. Corn is a good that's going to come from North and South America. The Eastern Hemisphere did not have corn in the entire hemisphere until after Europeans contacted North and South America in the late 14 and early 1500s. But when it's brought back across the Atlantic Ocean, corn and peanuts grow really, really, really well in Western Africa. So it completely alters their diet, it completely alters their farming methods. Alright, so that is the end of our talk on China, Japan, and the Songhai Empire. If you have any questions, please let me know. And again, make sure that you review this material because it is fair game for map quizzes, vocabulary quizzes, unit tests, and your SOL.